constitutional law and human rights, so topics that are legally pertinent to our gathering here. He served as clerk for Justice White in the U.S. Supreme Court. He has many books to his credit. Legitimacy in History and American Constitutional Theory, Law and Love, The Trials of King Lear, Political Theology, 4 new chapters in the Concept of Sovereignty, and many others. I picked those out as of interest to our gathering today. Today, Paul will be speaking on a constitutional culture between law and power. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks for having us. Thanks for all of you for staying around. I know it's been a long day. But you'll see a certain similarity in approach, I think, in my remarks and Mark's remarks last night. We both started by speaking about our somewhat frustrating experience of practice of comparative constitutionalism. But then you'll see a big difference. Where Bernard goes minimalism, and I'm going to go maximalism. Hopefully we can talk about this difference after this. Should I be speaking into this? Yeah. Okay. As a young lawyer, I was asked by the American State Department to travel to Liberia to help draft a new constitution. After years of authoritarian governments, the Liberians had recently had a military coup, the young leaders of which were now promising to transition to democracy. I naturally wondered what was wrong with their old constitution, and I went off to Georgetown Law School Library. I was very surprised to find that the constitutional text was pretty much the same as that of the United States. Well, it was a lesson. 2 nations with the same text do not have the same constitution. The problems Liberia faced arose not from the text, but from the absence of constitutional culture. Changing the text was not going to change this. The country did indeed descend into years of civil war. The mistake of the American legal missionaries was to think that the problem was to convince the leadership to accept a text. The legal text, however, neither produces nor controls power. Power there was palpably evident. No complicated questions of hegemonic forms of discourse, no subtle economic structures, no complex history of relations among political parties. Even traditionally powerful families had been displaced by the coup. There were, instead, young men with guns. It was close to Hobbes' idea of a state of nature. The brutality of the situation clarified matters for me, but it did not change the basic problem of creating and maintaining a constitutional culture. The Constitution is not a gift that experts can give to a country. We Americans were simply projecting onto the Liberians our familiar fetishism of the text. We Americans regularly translate our political structures into issues of textual interpretation. For example, war powers, affirmative action, abortion, educational opportunity. These are the familiar disputes we have about the Constitution. Think of a battle over Trump's proposed immigration ban. Again, immediately becomes a constitutional issue. My African adventure taught me that no legal text exists apart from political practices, which in turn are ways of acting within and with respect to institutions. In the United States, the privilege of text is the privilege of courts, for they have the authority to decide what the text means. Although here too, political reality may not follow judicial decisions. In Africa, we were talking about texts with no thought whatsoever as to how to create effective courts. It's now a familiar claim that a text does not control its own meaning. Between text and decision, there must be an interpretation. When we disagree on interpretations, we cannot resolve the problem by appealing to the text. Some of the justices don't believe that. Rather, the text is itself a source of the plurality of opinions. Legal theory often focuses on the meta issue of establishing a legitimate interpretive methodology. Those disputes, however, occur against a background of common practice that sets the boundaries of our interpretive debates. We can think of those boundaries as establishing a kind of idea of respect for the text. I learned in Africa that such a practice of respect is itself a substantial achievement. If a text is indeterminate over a range of meanings, how exactly can we persuade those with power to commit to a text? More precisely, how can we convince them in a way that produces a meaningful restraint on their political behavior? Which means accepting the interpretation of some institution as authoritative. We certainly should not send the postmodernists on foreign missions to build law. But their message of indeterminacy is hardly a revelation to the seemingly less sophisticated. An example from Liberia illustrates the point, one I always tell my students about it. When we were drafting the new Constitution, the minimum age set for the president became critically important in negotiations. Here you may know that we have to be 35 president. So they were arguing there about what is the age. And the reason for this was very straightforward. The leader of the coup, a man named Samuel Doe, was very young. If he accepted an age limit, it would signal willingness to hand over governance to those whose qualifications included more than having executed previous administration. The age limit was accepted, but that was not the end of the story. Shortly thereafter, we learned that the young leader had a new birth certificate. He was now old enough to run for president. The lesson: no single provision of the text controls a political outcome. There's always lots of law, which means there are always multiple sources to use in the pursuit of a political goal. No legal text sets its own agenda. Writing more or different law will not solve the problem of indeterminacy. Institutions created for one purpose can be deployed to opposite ends. Think of our own problems with regulatory capture. Looking back on my African experience, I see that I did not know what I was doing. I thought the battle was over legal text, but the real issue had nothing to do with getting the text right. It had to do with how legal text is imagined within a community. The Constitution, I learned, is not about text, but about culture. Those young men with guns operated without a legal imagination. My African adventure taught me something else important, although less evident at the time. I learned that the transition from revolution to constitution is the most difficult and the most important step in a nation's history. The revolutionary leadership of Liberia failed to make the transit. They ended up dead. We might not have have a lot of sympathy for them, but their country did descend into civil war and violent chaos. Revolutions demolish an existing legal order, but revolutions have a way of turning into civil war, and civil war into chaos. This transition from revolution to constitution is exactly what has been at issue in the aftermath of the spring initiative that's come up in several panels over the last day. And in most cases, the transition in those countries has failed. Establishing a constitution is not merely a matter of writing the text, but creating a culture that mediates between legal text and political power. And because power is never wholly controlled by law, the transition from revolution to constitution is never really finished. It's not an event that happens, but a sort of existential condition carried forward in a set of practices and beliefs. The possibility of crisis undermining the legal order is always there. There must therefore be a continuing choice for law. Carl Schmitt expressed a reverse image at this point when he emphasized the decision for the exception. The possibility of that decision means, however, that law is no less a choice. Culture is a way of speaking of this existential condition, for culture is neither a gift from outside experts nor a natural condition. It is rather a way of imagining the self and others within a community. It continues only as long as the imagination remains, and that, in some deep sense, is up to us. One way of understanding the contemporary crisis in American politics is to see it as a failure in constitutional culture. It can no longer be taken for granted that those with political power will make the choice for law, nor that the people will continue to make that choice. Populism generally has limitations for law. It rejects the claim that law and legal institutions are representative. It sees elite self-interest in place of American identity. Thus, Trump often attacks the law and its institutions. He promises deals, not rules. The lesson of Liberia should make us worry that absent that culture, we may not be so far from our own civil war, but hopefully that war will be considerably less violent. We American constitutional missionaries focused on text because we think we know how to draft the Constitution. We do not know how to create a constitutional culture. 20 years after I was sent to Africa, a different administration, again filled with bright young lawyers who thought they knew but they did not, went off to draft a constitution for Iraq. The stakes were considerably higher, but the disaster is much the same. And it's not just the State Department that makes this mistake of confusing what we can know with what we need to know. Something similar is true of most scholars of comparative constitutional law. They know how to compare constitutional texts that specify structures, norms, and procedures. They can also compare cases from constitutional courts. They just have to get them translated. It's easy to ask how different courts treat, for example, access to abortion. But do we really think that one can understand the meaning of Roe versus Wade by reading the text? And I'm a great fan of reading the text. Rather, the text serves as a sort of nodal point for multiple strands of meaning involving courts, families, churches, feminism, politics, cultural wars, conscientious objection, the Holocaust, and much more. Each strand has a history that continues to bear on its meaning. Each is set in relationship with all the others. These strands do not form a single coherent whole, but offer multiple points of access to a conflict. They offer the sources from which we argue when we try to persuade each other. Wanting to be experts, we privilege an object about which we can be expert, the legal text. Even courts that look like they're doing the same thing, voting on cases and writing opinions, may be imagining their roles quite differently. Does the court imagine that it is conserving a set of values or progressively moving toward their realization? Is it balancing diverse interests and the power of different interest groups? Is it speaking to litigants, citizens, officials, other judges, or a global audience? Is it being reasonable or is it being principled? There can be a difference. In whose voice is it speaking? Does it claim authority as an expert in the law? If so, is that expertise a matter of substance or a matter of procedure? Is its claim to authority a political claim, resting on the process of its own selection, or is it a representative claim? Does it speak in the vernacular or in a technical language? Does it imagine itself managing the relationship of law to the political, or does it imagine itself as acting outside of the political? All of these questions have histories, and these histories continue to bear on the purpose. Suppose my African interlocutors had raised these issues in trying to understand what we were asking, what we were asking them to do. What would I have answered? All I could have said was, do it like us. That, however, would have required that they eat us. If constitutional culture extends across an entire world of meaning, then the ambition of a comparative study not only becomes harder to accomplish, it becomes largely incoherent. Cultures encompass beliefs and practices, but equally exceptions to the beliefs and practices. Every legal rule comes with a doctrine of exceptions. Those exceptions are not somehow implicit in the rule. You can't derive them from the rule. But they are rather what makes sense in the world within which the rule is intended to operate. Rule and exception allow us to deal with tensions, not by resolving contradictions, but by living with them. Our constitutional culture does not resolve issues, but rather offers resources that can be put to use in competing arguments and practices, held together in temporary, what I would call temporary equilibrium. Constitutional culture falls between law and power. We can compare laws and we can measure power, but we can neither compare nor measure culture, for we have no access to the object of our inquiry apart from an interpretation. A culture exists only in the social imaginary. It is the work of interpretation. The stability of a culture is a structure of realized meaning. It is not a measurable object in the world. We suffer accordingly from a version of the Heisenberg principle. There is no description of the culture that is not itself a creative act of interpretation. Comparing two cultures is more like comparing two novels than it is like comparing two laws. is this actually a comparison at all? Or is this just a way of speaking from multiple interpretive efforts? The lesson I took away from my African adventure and the chain of reflections that began there is that useful comparative work must be grounded in an interpretation of the constitutional culture within which one finds oneself. Culture precedes theory, for constitutional theory is itself a product of cultural practices and beliefs. Absent that, culture theory would be as nonsensical as trying to read the Federalist Papers to the Liberians. So in what follows, I'm going to be done with African now. In what follows, I will make three different but related efforts to examine American constitutional culture. I want in this way to put theory in its place, but also to point to the sorts of inquiries that a serious examination of constitutionalism would have to pursue. First, I examine the idea of a science of law, which continues to operate in judicial opinions and to be taught in American law schools. Second, I look at the representation of law in the myths that inform our dual heritage of Athens and Jerusalem. Science and myth identify fundamental strands of reason and faith in the American political imaginary. My third strand examines the self-consciously historical character of our constitutional culture. American constitutionalism began by imagining history as the space for the realization of abstract truth. That is, you articulate inalienable rights and then you apply the realization of abstract truth. This was a revolutionary ideal displaced by the emergent constitutional culture, which understands history itself as a site of ultimate beliefs. History is now the work of the popular sovereign, which is the absolute as it shows itself in time. So what follows is a kind of triangulation looking at three strands of science, religion, and history. Together, these strands craft the character of a thick description of American constitutional culture. They don't really apply to character, they suggest the directions in which such an effort would have to move. You can find details in some of the Okay, so let's turn to science. The modern American law school dates only from the end of the 19th century, when Christopher Langdell introduced the case law method of study at Harvard. Law belonged in the modern university just to the degree that it could be studied and taught as a science. Before that, you studied law in the law, in practice. So to bring it into the university, it had to look like a university discipline. The idea of a science simultaneously shapes the object of study, law, and the character of those who study. Professors need a science just as much as a science needs professors. And Langdell's accomplishment was argument of the object, to normalize a technique of the study of law within the imaginative space of late 19th century science. Langdell proposed that judicial opinions be studied as evidence of underlying rules that are themselves the truth of the law. The rules are the real object of this new science. Accordingly, the particular decision, opinion, is not valued as a form of practice or as a unique response to a conflict of individual interests, nor is it seen as a representation of an abstract truth, again, as it realizing some abstract principle. Is this the law we have as an image of the law we should have? Instead, judicial opinions are points of access to an immanent order. One must learn to see through the cases to the true principles of order. This is much like any other science. It does an experiment, to see through the experiment to the underlying immanent principles of order. So Langdell famously said that the library is the laboratory of the law school. The pedagogy is new, but the idea of legal science is not exactly new. In the field of constitutional law, this approach of reading the cases as evidence of an evolving system of reason already informed the work of the treatise writers of the latter part of the 19th century. The truth of the Constitution was not something established by the framers. They came to be seen as rather than in science. And it was not located in abstract principles that existed in particular cases, moral or religious. Rather, the object of the study of constitutional law is the character of reason as it works itself out in the institutions of governance, especially the courts. The scholar's role then is to articulate these immanent principles of order. It is to see the law behind the law. Langdell and his followers thought of the cases as evidence, but none of them treated the cases in the way that a modern social scientist might. They did not collate data, they did not run regressions. Indeed, it is wrong even to think of this work as grounded in data. The study of statistics was indeed starting to appear in the university, but not in law school. It's there now, but it wasn't. The qualitative approach to evidence dominated over the quantitative. Langdell's science looked a good deal like the contemporaneous rise of anthropology, psychoanalysis, and, of course, evolution. All share a common framing idea. Phenomena are to be treated as evidence of an immanent order, what I would call a system. In the late 19th century, system brought order to change. This was Darwin's accomplishment, to see that order and change are not incompatible. Indeed, that change can express order might be the mantra of the era. The Protestant faith in progress remains, but it's now grounded in science rather than providence. This attitude toward systems brings with it a shift of scientific attention away from individual consciousness and the virtues of action, which had characterized Protestant intellectual function. Because an immanent order is not something of which the agent is aware. A gap emerges between what an agent thinks he is doing and what science reveals to be the meaning of the act. Again, think of psychoanalysis, or think of it. Accordingly, the legal scientist does not interrogate actors to see what they thought they were doing. Rather, he studies judicial opinions as evidence of the system. A few decades later, legal realists attacked Langdell and his followers for perpetrating a sort of academic fraud. Langdell's formal science of law was revealed to be studying nothing but its own imaginings. This is the idea of representation we talked about earlier. Despite this attack, modern constitutional law remains deeply Langdellian. More so, I think, than any other course in the law school curriculum. Exemplary judicial opinions are studied as evidence of immanent principles. Opinions are studied not as products of compromises of fractious competing parties or as practical judgments regarding complex situations. Constitutional expertise is claimed by experts in doctrine who can locate the truth of freedom of speech or executive power behind the words of the opinions. They have a theory, right? But this is what's behind the coherent theory of First Amendment behind the decisions. There remains a deep belief that the Constitution is a systemic work of reason. This belief is not the possession of academics alone. It is actually what the judges prefer to offer when their opinions argue from the precedents. Their effort is to make sense, principled sense of all of these opinions, precedents. It is what the lawyers offer up as well in the briefs. Remarkably, constitutional scholars continue as members of Langdell's church long after they have dropped belief in Langdell's God. Most of these scholars think that the legal realists actually won the battle with the formalists. They teach the case law method as if they were followers of Langdell, that's what they teach their students, but they are firmly in the legal realist camp in their understanding of how law is made and how it can be used. So when they write an op-ed, they're legal realists. When it's in the classroom, they're legal formalists. They understand that constitutional law is a field of contestation of power. They want to know who is using legal means to what ends. Of course, this is why we argue so much about judicial appointments. They will attack Gorsuch as merely an appointment, but when he issues an opinion, they will put it within the entire corpus of the legal system and explain how it itself is a site for the order of law. This bipolar attitude is not a kind of false consciousness. I don't mean to suggest that they're hypocrites. Rather, they are using the intellectual tools at hand to respond to the problem of the relationship of law to power. Taking up law, the scholars follow Langdell. Taking up power, they follow the legal realists. It is as if they can see only one side of the problem at a time. They want to believe in the integrity of law, integrity here in the beginning sense. Nevertheless, they know that power and interests are using the law to pursue ends that are exogenous to the constitutional order itself. Each perspective gives a complete account, but each does so only by suppressing the other. The Constitution is an immanent system of order. The Constitution is a play of power. The problem of the relationship of law to power, of authority to freedom, is therefore excluded from the beginning. They have no perspective that can take them both at once. With that separation of forms, it is not possible to see the constitutional order as simultaneously given and chosen. Okay, now I'm going to talk about, that was science, now I'm going to talk about myth. That there is no necessary relationship between law and power has been known at least since Genesis. God wrote the first Constitution, the law of Eden. It had just one provision: don't eat the apple. Adam and Eve freely reject the law. So much for the power of a law that comes as a gift from outside. St. Paul captures this idea of a free agent before an exogenous law when he writes that law creates conditions of its own violation. Quote, the law was brought in so that trespass might increase. Well, every parent knows that setting forth a rule creates two possibilities. The child can either embrace the rule or violate it. Like the parent, God has the power to punish a violation, but that comes too late to give force to law. God's Constitution is already a dead letter. There's no going back to Eden. If God wrote the first Constitution, then Adam and Eve staged the first revolution. The story of divine creation begins with the word, but the story of human creation begins with the act. Law as a text has no power to secure its own respect. The force of law is not a function of its author, even if its author happens to be God. There must be a choice for law. The problem of Genesis is that man keeps choosing violation. The violation of law is an affirmation of freedom. Had Adam and Eve simply obeyed, we might still be in the garden, but we would not know that we are free. Adam and Eve stage a revolution, but they never quite get around to writing a constitution, although it's possible that their son Cain did. Cain too exercises his own freedom through transgression. He murders Abel. He too suffers exile as punishment. Now, however, we are explicitly told that he went on to found a city. The pattern is set. Freedom's origin is in the act of violation. The burden of freedom is to create a space for law. Apart from his capacity for violence, Cain brings just one thing to this task of political construction: God's mark upon his flesh. That too is a text written by God. That mark upon the flesh is a synecdoche of law. It links representation to identity, and with that, text to power. The task of myth is to bring law and power into alignment. The chosen people must choose to obey. Only then can we have authority and freedom. Fear of punishment is not enough to ground the stability of this choice. Genesis and Exodus show us that the choice for law is stabilized only as the internal narrative of the history of the Jews grows. Without that history, God's command is no more effective than offering a text to a West African country. Adam and Eve knew the law, and they knew who had authored it. The force of law, however, is a function of the biblical narrative, not of God's command. The Jewish people must come to trust their God, and that takes time, for they must build a history together. The Jews must be slaves before they can be rescued. They must turn to idols before they can destroy them. They must violate the law before they can obey its commands. The Hebrew Bible, then, is the narrative of this mutual movement of God toward community and community toward God. Having built a common life, they can persuade each other. The movement, accordingly, is not only in one direction. Sometimes the patriarchs persuade God to change his will. The biblical text, of course, is more than an interesting historical record. For people of faith, it is not one myth among others. Rather, it's constitutive of national identity. Studying the text of Jude does not simply learn history. Rather, he becomes it. The reader replicates the process recounted in the text. He too comes to live with his God. When he sees the narrative as his own, he too comes to live with his God when he sees the narrative as his own. Accordingly, the text does not merely represent the Jews, but constructs them again and again. the Jews become the people of the book, in the double sense of the subjects and the readers of the text. Representation becomes identity in a kind of constitutional double. Occupying this double position of reader and participant, Jews continue to confront the choice of the law. Freely choosing the law, they become what they already are. The force of law arises from this double. This is exactly what was missing in Liberia. Looking at the law, the political community could not see their own identity. Some might have thought it was a good idea to do what the law said, but it was a good idea not to eat the apple. Good ideas are always in competition with other plans and proposals. A culture of constitutionalism is not one choice among others. It is an affirmation of identity in and through law. This hardly means that we are no longer capable of change as a reform and revolution, for law is an affirmation, not a denial of freedom. We find something quite similar to the Hebrew Bible myth of in the West's earliest sustained philosophical treatment of the nature of the polity. In Plato's Republic, the interlocutors freely construct an ideal constitutional theory. Socrates calls a city of speech. They construct a just order, responsive to their assessment of human nature, class interests, and political security. Law appears as the product of a technical craft that is responsive to the needs for which individuals come together to live in a political community. There is no excellence in the law apart from the excellence of the city, and none of the city apart from that of the individual citizens. The end of the citizen and the city is justice. Precisely because of this, philosophers should be kings. They can be the craftsmen of justice. That, in a nutshell, is the early books of the Republic. I like to think of my Liberian adventure as falling in this Platonic tradition. That's because I just got a PhD in philosophy right before I went to Liberia. I learned there what Plato already understood. Philosophy, what we can call constitutional theory, can be the ground for the drafting of law, but it cannot itself be the ground for enforcing law. Thus, Plato's characters in the Republic consider how it could ever happen that their ideal constitution would be taken up by an actual city. How could it become more than a city of speech? The philosophical problem of the force of law appears already within the terms of the ideal construction. How can we make this real? Citizens of their imagined city must believe in the authority of law. They must choose the law, for they must be willing to defend the constitutional order. That belief cannot depend upon the completion of their own philosophical inquiries. Politics is not a classroom seminar, although Gene Rostow said something like that years ago. Politics is not a classroom seminar, and most citizens have no interest in such a pursuit. So Plato needs to imagine a ground for faith in law, and he offers a ground for such a civil faith by naturalizing that which we, the readers, know to be only a product of the founder's craft. This is his famous noble law, which says that membership in a political class, under their three, is a function of the natural quality of the individual's soul, with different methods in their soul. We are born into our social and political position. Readers know this to be a fiction, but the imagined members of the city must take it as an expression of their identity. Why, however, would anyone believe this? Plato answers that they will believe it if it's all they ever hear. We believe many myths about the origins of the world and the polity. Is it any harder to believe in the metals of the soul than to believe that sovereign people brought about their own political existence? Plato's myth actually relies less on a claim about the comparative worth of individual souls than it does on the pre-political morality of the family. To believe the myth is to believe that all members of the city are born of the same divine mother, the Earth Mother. Behind their different skills, positions, and responsibilities, all citizens must believe that they share a common origin, unless a familial bond of love. The ground of law, Plato suggests, is not knowledge, but care. Care is never abstract. One loves one's family, not the ideal. The point of the myth, then, is not simply to naturalize difference, but to ground belief in collective identity. citizens must see in political order a representation of their own identity. Believing this, they would choose the law. Okay, that was, then now I'm going to turn to history. And bring it up to the present. What are the conditions of belief under which citizens will subordinate their own interests and even their own lives to the constitutional order? Genesis told us that divine authorship is not enough. Plato told us that justice is not enough. Langdell told us it's not a problem, for law will take care of itself. The realists responded that not the law, but those with power will take care of themselves. I've argued the constitutional culture lies between law and power, and that only here can we find an answer to the question of the force of law. The polity's gods dwell in this space between law and power. Strikingly, the American framers did not think law could be stripped of its connection to the gods. Like Plato, they believed there is a technique of constitutional creation, unalienable rights, and institutions too, not just normal institutions. These were men of the Enlightenment who thought that they had access to a new science of politics. The content of the science of politics may change over time, different rights, different structures, but the fundamental idea that a constitution is a function of reason remains. Constitutional order, as the first page of the Federalist Papers announces, must be the product of deliberation and choice, or as I would say, of reason and will. The revolutionary force of will must be directed to a constitution that is the product of reason. Despite their belief in the new science of politics, that paragraph more or less, I think, summarized the framers' general attitude towards constitutional construction. Despite their belief in the new science of politics, the American founders still faced exactly the same problem with force of law. A successful state requires more than good law. It requires more than the founder's science because a decision for law must be made at every moment. The founders, like their classical predecessors, thought that this choice requires a kind of moral excellence. Even the rather irreligious American founders concluded that they had to embed the political in the religious. Men had to be moral before they could be legal, and they had to be religious if they were to be moral. Kant may have thought, the famous line, that a well-wrought constitution could work among a race of devils, but the American founders did not believe that good laws alone could produce the citizens required to sustain and support laws. No constitutional order can secure itself by claiming justice as its ground. For it's precisely the claim of justice that motivates revolution. The Constitution has to be more than a good idea. The American founders shared with Plato the belief that the stability of law depends on attaching law to the prevailing sources of morality. Thus, in 1798, John Adams wrote, this is the quote, "We have no government armed with power capable of contending with human passions unbridled by morality and religion. Avarice, ambition, revenge, or gallantry would break the strongest cords of our Constitution as a whale goes through a net. Our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people." Washington had offered the same warning in his presidential farewell address, delivered just 2 years earlier. This is Washington. "Of all the dispositions and habits which lead to political prosperity, religion and morality are indispensable supports. In vain would that man claim the tribute of patriotism who should labor to subvert these great pillars of human happiness, these firmest props of duties of men and citizens. The mere politician, equally with the pious man, ought to respect and cherish them. And let us, with caution, indulge in the supposition that morality can be maintained without religion." Washington makes clear that the endurance of the Platonic belief, reason does not disavow religion, but recognizes the need for religion as a supplement to theory. To tether power to law, there must be religious faith. Advance the story just a few decades, however, and we find quite a different approach to the problem of the force of law. In his famous Lyceum address of 1838, Lincoln writes of a problem arising from the passing of the revolutionary generation. In 1838, the last of the veterans of the Revolution are dying. "These veterans bore scars but were the physical ground of a memory of a revolution. They were marked like Kahn. The veterans constitute what Lincoln called, quote, a living history, found in every family, a history bearing the indubitable testimonies of its own authenticity, when the limbs mangled and the scars of wounds received in the midst of the very scenes related. Their wounds literally inscribe the presence of the popular sovereign on the bodies of the citizens. Linking the scarred body of the veteran to the constitutional text, Lincoln gives voice to a new American political theology. In a sort of political rapture, Lincoln pleads, quote, let reverence for the laws be breathed by every American mother to the lisping babe that prattles on her lap. Let it be taught in schools, in seminaries, and in colleges. Let it be written in primers, spelling books, and almanacs. Let it be preached from the pulpit, proclaimed in legislative halls, and enforced in the courts of justice. That's reverence for the law. Lincoln no longer sees a need to appeal to morality outside of law, that is religion. Just the opposite. Reverence for law is to fill the normative space of the community, including the church. Remember, in the pulpit, we're supposed to hear this. Moreover, reverence for law is no longer refers to a natural or a divine law. Lincoln's civil religion locates the absolute squarely within the history of the nation. The force of law comes not from an immanent order and not from individual interest, but from a memory of revolution. For at that moment, the popular sovereign was directly present. Lincoln sees that the authority of the Constitution need not be grounded in those virtues of character that are cultivated by belief in either the gods who formed us or the gods who will judge us. In what then is it grounded? Lincoln's not quite sure, or at least he doesn't quite have the words to express his intuition. When pressed, he can offer only the language of reason. Law, he says, embodies the intelligence of the community. But his emphasis is on reverence, not reason. His idea of reverence is precisely not that of Adams or Washington. Lincoln shifts the object of reverence from God to the Constitution. Reverence for law is to surround the citizen at home, at school, and at church. This is not to fetishize the text, for the object of reverence is not really the text. It is the popular sovereign, but often the text. The Constitution is a remnant of sovereign presence. The popular sovereign is the new God. It is the appearance of the absolute in history. Lincoln is speaking of an emerging constitutional culture. It's no longer the last judgment, but something like a first memory that is the ground force of law. It is the memory of the movement for revolution, the Constitution. The Constitution is a trace of the popular sovereign who created itself in the free act of violation that was the revolution. History has become its own ground. Lincoln lived within a new political imaginary of law in which Constitution displaces common law. Blackstone had offered time immemorial as a ground of common law. This was more than a little like the Platonic myth of origin. But the American Constitution was produced within the span of living. No one bears the scars of time immemorial. Lincoln's intuition is that between revolution and Constitution stands the veteran, bearing the scars of his service. An American constitutional faith has emerged that models citizenship for the veteran. This is not because American constitutionalism will rely on military virtues of classic republicanism. Military virtue is useful to politics in the same way that good health is useful. It may be necessary for successful politics, but it does not ground the force of law. Even a military, after all, can rebel. Lincoln describes a constitutional culture that rests on semiotics of political faith in which one text displaces another. Critical to this idea of the veteran is the scar. Unlike a wound, which announces itself in the fact of pain, the scar must be read. War can cause injury just like disease, that is without sense or purpose. An army passing through is not so different from a plague passing through. The scar is an entirely different matter. The veteran's scar operates like King's mark. It is a sign of sovereign presence. Humanity suffers pain. Indeed, the contemporary human rights movement, I would argue, is founded on the common experience of pain. It's founded on the wound, not on the scar. The scar distinguishes individuals and communities precisely because its meaning must be recovered through an act of reading. The scar is the wound become a representation. It is a context. Reading this text, we place the wounding in the narrative of national self-creation. The movement from wound to scar is that from the body of man to the body of the citizen. It is from the moral to the political. Politics begins, I argue, with the free act of violation. The sign of that violation is the scarred body. The scar is accordingly the representation of freedom. Even the scars of the defeated can be signs of freedom lost, just as the scars of the torture victim can become signs of freedom regained. The scars of the Revolutionary War veteran are read in the narrative of violation as the free act of political self-determination. This move from act to text is exactly what is at stake in the move from revolution to constitution. Lincoln reads the veteran's scar as a representation of sacrifice. The scarred veteran bears the stigmata of his faith in the popular sovereign. Having given himself up to the revolution, the veteran survives as a text to be read by all who witness the scar. The Christian symbolism infusing the civil religion coming into its own in the mid-19th century is palpable. From wound to scar, from scar to text, from representation to identity. So in the 19th century, when people freely say we're a Christian nation, this is what because the scar marks the body directly, it's a text that constantly crosses the line between representation and identity. For the veteran, the scar brings to mind the circumstances of sacrifice. At that moment, the citizen was in the presence of an ultimate meaning that literally displaced every other meaning in his life. He existed then as the point of expression of the popular sovereign, the new absolute as it appears in history. The American civil religion is complete only when the constitutional text steps into the place of the veteran's scarred body. Both are texts inscribed by the revolutionary action of the popular sovereign. The sovereign is the common author. Of both texts, we can ask of what it is a representation. And for both, the answer is the popular sovereign. As the legal text displaces the veteran's body, we take possession of the text by reading it as a representation of our identity. Recalling the narrative, we become the object of that narrative. In this movement from representation to identity, we find the force of law. The constitutional text, then, is our common scar. We can give this idea a more precise meaning. For this text, we can give it a more precise meaning. For this text, citizens will sacrifice themselves. Doing so, they express the truth of their own identity, which is to be a part of a popular sovereign. Thus, representation is linked to identity through an imagined sacrifice that is an act of scarring. It makes little difference whether the sacrifice is an act that we recall from the past or one that we imagine in the future. Because past and future merge in this act of freedom. The Constitution is the product of our own freedom. Only so do we solve the problem of how successive generations can be free under an inherited Constitution. This is the choice for law that is our constitutional culture. There's a direct line from young Lincoln speaking at the local Lyceum to President Lincoln speaking at Gettysburg. There we see very concretely what is at stake in Lincoln representative text to identity through sacrifice. Lincoln now speaks of sacrifice as, quote, a new birth of freedom. Sacrifice refounds the nation by calling up the presence of the popular sovereign. Once again, sacrifice produces a text. We are, he says, a nation, quote, dedicated to a proposition. Our constitutional culture arises out of this illusion of the text of the body and the text of the law. This is the constitutional government that links law and power as representation becomes identity. Okay, now a few words in conclusion. First, like other forms of faith, the ground of constitutional culture is not justice, rather it's identity. A constitutional theory of justice It comes early and it comes late in the project. It guides the framer's construction of text, and it has a role in interpretation. We can talk more about that in questions. But we're not bound to our law because it gets the theory right. Rather, we want the Constitution to be just because it is our own. Second, the fundamental structural relationship is that of representation to identity, not principle in its application. We must see through the text to identity. We must see through the Constitution of the Revolution. This seeing through is exactly the imaginative structure that links law to power and power to law. Bound to history, this project is deeply connected to the forms of violence, because political meaning comes into the world through sacrifice. Whether we can have politics without the star is a deeply troubling and deeply difficult question. Not one I'm going to try and answer now. For now, it's enough to say that we cannot understand our constitutional culture without thinking through the relationship of sacrifice to freedom. Third, we will make little progress in understanding American constitutional culture unless we place it within the twin strands of the genealogy of our modernity. This is both an Enlightenment project and a Judeo-Christian project. For this reason, constitutional theory needs to be supplemented by political theology. Constitutional theory will always find itself in the antithesis that separated the formalists from the realists. Scholars will theorize justice or measure interests. The constitutional culture, however, lives and dies in the imagination. It's the structure of meaning that cannot be measured but only interpreted. Fourth, the American belief in popular sovereignty is not measured in elections or opinion polls. It is a belief grounded in an entire culture. It is true only as long as it continues to inform the imagination. It has survived in the scarred veteran, the memorials in Washington, political rhetoric, popular films, and a Lincolnian reverence for law. I won't want to put this as well. These two are sites for the choice of law. Today we have good reason to think that this culture may be retreating before other ways of imagining politics. One of the very striking characteristics of the last election was the absence of the language of sacrifice from the rhetoric of the candidates. Finally, the approach to constitutionalism that I have pursued cannot offer a prescription for others, any more than one religion can offer any suggestion for others. The constitutional culture is neither good nor bad. It is rather a way of being in a meaningful world. This approach can, however, lead us to ask of others, what gods occupy the space between law and power in your nation? And if there are no such gods, how do you manage without them? Thank you.
Thanks so much, Paul, for that great talk. We have time for some questions and comments. I see one already here.
A very quick question along those lines. You're talking about scars, and I'm thinking about the invisible scars that go along with war that are appearing so frequently, especially as people are using drones and all of that, and the suicides, the PTSD, all of that or difficult to visualize aspect of sacrifice. And I'm wondering how that might affect how those sacrifices are employed in the logics that you're outlining.
Yeah, that's a really good question, and I think we've seen real change in the last 20 years on this issue, right? So now, one thing we've learned since the 60s, I think, is the cult of the veteran, right? It's politically unacceptable to criticize the veteran, right? You criticize the politics, but you cannot criticize the veteran. And why is that? Well, for the reasons I was trying to suggest. Now, as we think about the veteran who suffers, right, we've seen much more openness to what we call the invisible scars. So the scarred veteran now automatically includes the person suffering from PTSD, right? And I would say, this is all very, very general, but of course what we understand as sacrifice or injury, right, will change as our other ideas change. There's no stability. It's not, in the sense that the Revolutionary War veteran showed the musket bullet, it has to look like that. It's the idea of the scar, the idea of sacrifice that's important. And so we see it again today. Go into this, but of course this is the way we understand the relationship between the terrorist and the citizen. You might be asked to bear the scar, bear the violence, of the terrorists. And again, what does that look like today? Well, it looks like everything from being shot up in your schools to 9/11 to understanding that political identity makes me individually vulnerable, and so and that's not something that I can withdraw and consent from.
But just a quick follow-up, the suicide counts might actually be reinforcing in those logics, and maybe we aren't dealing with those suicides in the way that we should, because we've got that notion that this is the sacrifice they have made, these wonderful veterans, they have ended their life.
Well, I think there's a flip side that maybe you're suggesting too, that I need to think about some more in this context, which is it's two-sided. There's the phenomena of bearing the popular sovereign in and through the body, which is what I focused on. But then there's a long, dark history in the country of casting or subordinating, casting aside those whom we do not believe are capable of bearing the sovereign. Right? So that's the history of the slave, the black. And that's very literally developed in Dred Scott. Why can they not be citizens? Because we can't read their sacrifice as sacrifices for the nation. Right? They are not capable of bearing the popular sovereign. So that's so we can see that, and this is the way I understand the progressive opening up of military service to different groups, and it's always the last word to be allowed into military service, because to be allowed to bear that is the privilege of citizenship. So of course, that talking about groups, it doesn't take us to, I think, your question, which is, might we not be suspicious of individuals as well as inadequate to bear, so to speak. But again, I want to emphasize the point I made at the very end. I think we see this all over. All over. You walk around this neighborhood and you see the plaques of the firemen on the walls of the firehouses. And they are in this tradition, the men, the first responders on 9/11. But I can't tell you how strong this idea remains, or whether it's going to remain. I think it's still vigorous, but there are lots of people, lots of forms of American politics. One has to question whether, in fact, this tradition. So
I have an easier time understanding science and religion. And on that regard, I want to very quickly mention that on the other side of the encounter between the West and non-Western, and the non-West, science and religion was perceived as these two definitive signs of Western superiority, missionary, and Western technology, imperialism, colonialism. So the different people in different parts of the world sort of see this with very different emotional responses.
And these two things are very much brought together at the end of the 19th century in the American imperialist project. It's both Christian and enlightened.
Yes. And so, in this context, let me point to this question of history. I agree with you, Dave, toward the end of your paper, the constitutional culture is neither good or bad, it's just about meaning, it's being in the context. I like that one very much. However, meaning is always itself shaped in sort of history of interpretation. I mean, it's going back to the more general, sort of more almost literary critical context of your talk. In light of that, how would you think through this question of history as a history of meaning, history of interpretation, including various stages, moments of pre-understanding, prejudice, pre-understandings, let's call it like that way. American history in particular is rather short. It's born within modernity. Right? So how would you compare that to this very long arrays of meaning? For instance, the meaning of the Constitution, identity, those kind of things. What if that was shaped in agricultural society, in feudalism, in sort of an ancient classical culture? So how would you place American this understanding, right, or meaning in that sort of like strong historical context in a strong sense?
Well, let me say three things about that. I hope that I made clear that the American, what's called the American constitutional / revolutionary configuration, is a contingent product of the moment, which is what we were talking about. I was talking before about when is the first constitution? And why is that? I said, well, because it has to be linked to revolution. Right? So when do you find this complex of revolution, which is this political science ideal to a certain ideal? So I think that the invention of revolution, talked about this earlier, the invention of popular revolution is deeply related to the invention of popular political science, a new political science. So revolution isn't just any popular mobilization. Revolution always has a theory. So you raise a good question. A cultural practice that emerges at a particular political moment, how long can it survive? And I would say a lot of the conversation over the last 2 days has been about that, right? How much can this absorb, right? It can't absorb, for example, what Mark was talking about earlier. If we become unclear about our borders, right, we can't absorb that, right? It's not a project about globalism. And this is why I wrote a lot about this. This is why American idea of law, legality, relationship with legality and sovereignty can't absorb international law. It has immense amount of difficulty. And most people think this is a kind of conservative plot against the liberals who are for international law. But actually, the model I'm talking about cannot deal with international law. Because law is taken as an expression of the authorship of the popular sovereign. So when you start talking about international law, you're talking about a completely different understanding of law. So it's a real problem in America to understand where international law fits, even when we completely agree with the substance of it. So there's no big gap between human rights law and American civil rights law. But lawyers and judges just don't know what to do with it, because it doesn't fit this model. It doesn't mean they can't make compromises and exceptions and try and do the best they can, but it doesn't easily fit. And it's always creating a crisis for business. So one thing we say is, don't know how much you can absorb, right? Don't know. I don't think we're at the limits yet. But I do want to say, what I was talking about here is what I would call the structure of our culture of political legitimacy. What is the relationship between these terms of popular sovereignty, of revolution, and constitution, reason, will, consent, and science? I don't talk at all about what is the content of law. The only point at which I came close to that was saying, we're not attached to our law because of its content. And I used to use the analogy of your children. I said, well, you don't love your children because they're just, right? You want your children to be just because you love them. And we have that kind of relationship to the Constitution as well. We don't shop for constitutions and ask, well, which one is the most just? And then say that, I'm moving there, right? We have ours, and we try and interpret it in ways that are consistent with our ideas about justice. And that powers tremendous change in the actual body of constitutional law in the last 2 years. So I have no patience at all for law. The content of law is somehow stable. That can't be right. So one way to think about your question is, how much reform in this respect of the just content of the law is compatible with the structural legitimacy of the law. When do those two things pull through? Right? That's a really interesting question. I have no idea. But that's where I would say it's better and well, understand.
Special education, I'm wondering about how far to take the trope of sacrifice here. And I guess I'm wondering, on the one hand, I guess, okay, so I'm imagining that the sort of comparative law exercise we started with might be solved as a way of going to another place and figuring out this kind of structures of sacrifice that are possible there, and kind of trying to promote those structures of sacrifice and so on, right? And I'm interested what you think about that. But then the other thing on sort of on the U.S. domestic level is that it sounds like you're indicating that the primary trope of identity is going to have to be sacrifice rather than some kind of idea of individual rights. And that therefore, if you see some kind of reason for hope in our present political situation, it would really be with those who kind of make a plea for sacrifice, which is to say, mostly kind of I would say, if you find it, it's really like with the Tea Party, right? For those people that say, cut the Medicare, even if it's bad for me, right? Because what I want is the freedom to, get sick and die, right? In the sense that you don't want any kind of guarantee, because that destroys the possibility of sacrificing freedom. You want to live in a situation of freedom in which you've got that precisely this lack of the safety net, right? And so that there's I mean, I guess I'm wondering if what's your take on that, whether the culture of sacrifice is really in that in that impulse toward destroying the safety net.
So let me be clear. I don't think that politics is about a death wish.
Okay.
A death wish. Right? So it can't mean that. Right?
But it's not about a death wish, it's about that freedom, that ability to then make the sacrifices for others that would help them, rather than having that possibility taken away from you because the state is already there to be the safety. Right.
Well, I'm not so sure about your example of safety net, but remember what I understand as sacrifice, right? Is the reading of the self as a point of instantiation and manifestation of the popular soul. So it's reading oneself in a political context in which you understand your individual interests, your finite interests, are being displaced by something that has ultimate value. Right? Now, and that I think is the I wrote a book about popular film to say that this is the theme of American popular film, and so I think that idea is very strong and very prevalent. But I'm still not quite sure I'm following. So it's not about willingness to die on a street corner so I don't have to take over anyone else. It could be, I suppose, under certain circumstances, it's possible to read that act as an affirmation of the state. But it's the reading of the act as an affirmation of the state that is important to me. And again, it's not the act itself that's so important. It's the imagining of the imagined possibility. So if we think about terrorism today, so a lot of times when I talk about this, people say, well, you don't have conscription. And so the state can't make a claim on a life. And I have two responses to that. Yes, I can. And it's just a congressional policy decision not to have conscription. The state has the authority to conscript. But two, it misses the point, which is that we live in an age today where everybody is conscripted all the time. And that is in their imagination, there's been a breakdown of the distinction between the combatant and the non-combatant. So the enemy today is the terrorist who attacks you because of your political identity. And that's what's imagined as the possibility of sacrifice for the state. So I think we've, in some way, normalized the practice of sacrifice as a routine element of everyone's daily life, which makes this whole model, I think, more powerful, not less powerful under contemporary conditions. Unless you tell me, which may be true for some people, that that's the last decade. and then we don't think about that anymore because we're all just too busy cutting people's welfare benefits. So I'm not sure I've fully answered you, but we can talk later.
But that argument about terrorism and conscription is great, right? Time's marching on. I see two comments. Maybe we can take them both, and then you respond to them both together. Please.
Yeah, this is very interesting. It's a lot like crusading ideology, mythology that I was talking about earlier, showing pictures by them anyway. I get it in terms of revolutionary scars, or maybe scars in the march of constitutional progress. I don't get how the scars of, say, the Vietnam vet would be in the same category, or the scars of the Iraq vet. You have to have. I mean, also on the flip side of the suicides bomber, the revolutionary martyr on the other side is doing the same thing. Claiming sacrifice. Sure. But so how does it? How can you?
Well, I don't agree with Prime. I mean, I think the interesting thing about Vietnam is the political process by which the veteran of the Vietnam War was elevated to this status. So if you go to the Vietnam Memorial, it's like one of the most moving sites in Washington. When I travel, I would go to veterans' cemeteries, pay my respects to the veterans. But they're often extremely moving sites. And so I think actually, I don't know if it's still true, but for a long period, let's say in the last decades of the 20th century, the Vietnam Memorial was, I think the most popular, certainly among the most popular sites to visit and express your respects. And it's very interesting because everybody's individual name is put up there. They have to be recognized for their sacrifice. So I don't really agree. I think that we have actually one of the great political efforts of the end of the 20th century was to put the Vietnam veteran in this tradition. I think we're still struggling with Iraq. I don't know where we are on Iraq veterans. I don't know what the memorials the Iraqi veterans are. I don't know if this yet. But of course, we have completely changed our discourse. I mean, I can remember back in the 60s when you yelled at the pig and threw tomatoes at veterans. It's just unheard of now. So I don't think I don't have a problem with Vietnam veteran in this account. There's an interesting. I had a student who was working on this point. What about all those private contractors? That's cool. Yeah, they're paid. They're mercenaries. Do they fit into this account? Where are they? Because they're doing most of the work. And he did this. He was an anthropologist. He did this great paper in which he showed that when they are killed or injured, right, their families make exactly the same claim that they must be recognized for the sacrifice they made. They're now, you go to the Blackwater office complex, and there's memorials, right? Just like the veterans' memorials. So they make a powerful claim that they want to be respected and seen as sacrificing for the state. I don't know how many people buy that, but they certainly feel this same pressure. Wait a second.
Yeah. And just briefly, when I saw the wall, William P. Ruckles' house is on there, and 6 other administration aides are actually among the 59,000. Though it couldn't possibly be the generations apart, grandson or just same name. It's a very strange phenomenon. But that's not what I want to talk about. I want to talk about the culture of the countries around the world. I mean, we're one world policeman, and then there's 190 other countries. We can't possibly understand all those cultures, but they can all understand us to some degree. So don't we get manipulated by the peoples around the world to a large degree? When the Project for a New American Century thinks, we'll start a democracy in Iraq and it'll spread to the whole Middle East, they're falling into a trap, obviously, that George Bush's father saw through. He wouldn't help the Shia uprising in '91 because he knew that would be another ally of Iran, which it ended up being. So we make so many mistakes, and we make mistakes on the power side, on the destructive side. We've tripled terrorism incidents, and so forth. Quadrupled them. I mean, are we better using the carrot than the stick for worldwide dealing?
So let me just make 2 comments. We are led by incredibly stupid people who make all kinds of mistakes in your sense, and I'm sure we would be better off with more carrots than sticks. But let me emphasize that as any cultural resource, this can be used. What I'm trying to say, it can be used to explain and to criticize. So the worst thing that can happen to a political leader is to send the boys, not the boys anymore, but to send the troops off to a war with which we do not identify as, a part of the American political project of affirming the existence of the popular self. That is the worst thing that can happen to a politician. And so we use the same form of discourse to say George Bush is a murderer. George Bush is, the least successful president anyway. Why? He had people killed for no reason, right? So this is not a set of justifications that are freely available for any decision to sacrifice individuals. It's just the opposite. If you can't persuade people that their sacrifice was justified, right? You got to contend with their mothers, and you got to contend with their families and their political communities. So the stakes are as high as can be under my understanding of forms of legitimacy for political leadership. And I'm actually again, this goes to Americans can't understand international law very easily. They can't understand humanitarian intervention very easily either for the same reason. Because if Syrians want to kill Syrians, that's not yet a reason for an American mother to say, I'm willing to sacrifice my son. Right? Why would I want my son to be killed because Syrians want to kill each other? So the grounds of justification narrow the more seriously you take this set of arguments. And of course, Bush's example. When it turned out Iraq was not threatening the United States, that there were no weapons of mass destruction, he was finished. Exiled to wherever he is and painting pictures, he's just finished. Because there's no alternative explanation. You can't say, yes, but we did X in Iraq. Even if there was an explanation. Marcia.
Yeah, Marcia Pally, NYU. Thank you very much. I wanted to weigh in on the discussion of sacrifice, which I appreciate all your comments, but I think it's not only about the military. We sacrifice when we pay taxes for the education of other people's children, or for the environmental regulations in areas in which we don't live, or for the FDA supervision of drugs or food we don't consume. When we contribute to something which we used to call the common good, quaintly back in the day. And I would I would argue that, following your remarks, that societies are premised on a productive notion of sacrifice for the sake of the society, especially the reciprocal covenantal political theory you described, the Israelite political theory that you described. But arguably all societies are premised on this. Otherwise there is no society, there's no common good. And perhaps one of the difficulties that we're facing today is the undermining of this understanding of society and of willing to contribute to something like the common pool, the common good, and then society starts to rend and unravel.
Okay, so I want to agree with the end of your comments about the
Okay.
People, they say this to me all the time, taxation or contribution in other sorts of ways to the common good should be understood as continuous with this idea of sacrifice. I want to resist that. I think what we want to pay and what we should pay are just taxes. I think our contribution to the common good is measured by justice. And that should be our aspiration, to have just laws. I think that sacrifice is not a matter of justice, actually. So when I want to talk about sacrifice, I want to talk about the real thing, and not the idea of just requirements. And so in my work, I tend to try and separate ideas of what I call legitimacy, which are what I was talking about today, from ideas of justice. And of course, these things become in tension. And of course, it's not so clear when I always say when the state becomes extremely unjust, it's not so clear that legitimacy shouldn't give way. It's like, when your child becomes a mass murderer, you may actually say enough, and disavow them. So I do want to try and keep those separate. Although the question about, of course, sacrifice doesn't mean you're going to get killed. I'm not talking about that. I'm trying to use that as kind of metaphor for how do we think about our relationship to the state and what it is that it can ask of us. Because sacrifice, if you think about it, is never just. It's always, and there's a reason for that, because it always has to be free. So you can't pass a law that says someone, X, Y, and Z requires to sacrifice themselves. It has to be a free act. You can conscript people into a military, so you can expose them to risk. But in the end, there's no law of America. I think it's not possible to have a law that assigns people to kamikaze units. I mean, it's actually an interesting problem in military ethics. What happens when somebody's going to get killed, right? And how do you deal with that? And I think there's a reason for that. That sacrifice, and for the reasons I was trying to identify, has to be a free act. Sacrifice is a kind of freedom. So trying to incorporate that idea of freedom into the foundation of the state's important. Whereas justice is, you can demand justice of people. You should act justly. So I think our tax system should be based on justice. It shouldn't be asking anybody to sacrifice. It should be asking of them what it is that they owe the state. Now, I do agree though with the last part, but that idea of what I'm calling justice is under tremendous stress today. And then of course we have people who don't want to pay their taxes and don't want to contribute and don't understand common good. All of that I completely agree with. And that's its own problem. It's a serious problem.
So I know there are more questions, but it's late. I know there are dinner reservations, so let me ask us to thank Paul for this wonderful time.